Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. Thank you for joining us at today's webinar hosted by the Science Journalists Association of India, in short SJAI. My name is Shrestha, and I'm a science communicator. As an SJAI member, let me quickly introduce you to SJAI and some housekeeping rules for this webinar. So SJAI is a network of journalists, and we carry out committed to science journalism in India. And this webinar series is part of SJI's ongoing efforts to support early career and mid-career journalists and science communicators with practical tools, resources, and conversations that can help people strengthen their reporting and storytelling. You can see more about our work and about our resources and apply to become a member. I'll share the link to SJI and our mailing list in a while. So few housekeeping rules before we quickly begin. So please keep your microphone muted and camera off during the session. You may use these functions during the Q&A session time. And please use the chat box to share your comments, resources, or questions during the session. If you plan to use comments or votes from this webinar in your reporting, please seek the speaker's permission. And we'll be recording this session and uploading it on YouTube. So do stay with us till the end to learn about a members exclusive webinar coming up on Tuesday next week. Coming back to today's session, in collaboration with Milli Archives Foundation, we'll focus on how science journalists can use archives. The Milli Archives Foundation is a non-profit network of archives and archivists dedicated to building, nurturing, and sustaining archives across India. The foundation works with individuals, families, organizations, and communities towards sustaining our collective memory and records in the form of accessible archives. Do visit them at milli.link. Now, it's my pleasure to introduce the speakers of this session, who are all the founding directors of Milli Archives Foundation. Jaya Ravindran is an archivist with nearly 3 decades of experience in the biggest public archives in the country, the National Archives of India. Her experience with almost all the core activities there has made her an invaluable resource person for training and committees on archives in the country. Dr. Maya Dodd teaches in the Department of Humanities at Flame University, and her research interests include digital humanities, South Asian studies, and issues of archiving in cultural studies. And Venkat Srinivasan heads the archives at NCBS, a public center for the history of science in contemporary India. He serves on the review boards for the archives across various institutes and organizations, and he has a core interest in archival processing of manuscript collections and oral history interviews. Finally, let me introduce our moderator for this session, Karthik Chatramurthy. Karthik is the senior digital editor at Monga Bay, India, heading multimedia reporting at the publication. He is part of the SJAI governing body. So over to you, Karthik, to take the session ahead.
Thanks, Shrestha, for coordinating all this so smoothly. It's a very difficult job, so thanks for that. And thanks everyone for joining in. I'm happy to see over about 40 people, and there are more trickling in, so that's great to see on a Thursday afternoon. Good afternoon from Bombay. The first time that I engaged with archives was, in fact, just last year when I did a story on ecology in Nilgiris, and the story allowed me to speak to people who did that research. But in addition, I had the chance to speak with Venkat, and that opened the doors and an idea for me that archives itself act as a resource for us journalists and for science communication as well. Plus, during the 2025 SJI conference, we had a panel session with archivists and museum curators. You can see that recording on YouTube. And this was a follow-up. This is like a follow-up to that session where we will actually try and illustrate how journalists can use archives in their regular work, in their storytelling. A big note that it's an introductory session. So some of you who have used these resources in your reporting might find the things basic, but I'm sure that with the 3 diverse experts that we have here, there's something that will surely be fresh for everybody to take away. And with that, I can start with my question in this session. Venkat, I'd like to start with you actually to set the background to this entire discussion. Can you just explain what's an archive and what constitutes an archive?
Sure. Thanks so much for the question. And just full disclosure, we've been discussing this, so this is slightly prepped. Can I share my screen, Karthik?
Yes, sure.
Yeah. All right. I'll just hide these. Okay. Hopefully you can see a slide that says, wait, what's an archive?
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. So, I mean, there are various definitions of it, but just broadly, these are spaces that keep things of enduring historical significance, right? Everything has the potential of entering an archive. There is a process to it becoming of archival value. This conversation that we're having has the potential of entering an archive. It has, this question of whether it has archival value is largely the domain of what archivists deal with. And we've given a few examples. It can be a photo album which reaches which is going from an Almira to a publicly accessible space. But questions of access, transparency, structured catalogs. I can't stress the word catalogs enough. But broadly, archives, what we like to say is open up a very huge landscape of enabling a diversity of stories based on material that we, as a larger society, have collected from our present and past. And this is then made available for future stories. And so it's really nice to have a conversation with you guys about this. I have a few examples of archives that I can share in a moment. Yeah, Karthik.
I really liked what you said, an enabler of stories. That's a nice way for us to remember what archives are. Jaya, actually, I wanted to ask you my next question. We have been speaking about various kinds of archives, but one of the archives that you speak about and you have worked with are public archives. Can you take us through what are public archives? Where do we find them, and what are they? How do we access them?
Yeah, Karthik. Basically, for a common man, when first and foremost, they may not be knowing about archives. But even if they know, they would be knowing only the public archives, because those are those, records which they know that government keeps their old records, and that's one place they can go in case they want to search out something. So public archives are basically repositories where government records go, basically records of all the government ministries, departments, everything covered under legislations or guidelines laid down by the government. And within the country, we can say that almost each and every state has its own archives. Union territories, they have their own archives. So even the new states which have been formed, they also are setting up archives. There is a specific way how it is to be done. So they follow that. So these are all over the country, you'll find these public archives. And of course, the colonial records, they are mostly found in the public archives of Tamil Nadu, West Bengal, Delhi, the Union Government Public Archives, that's the National Archives of India, and of course, Maharashtra, because that's where the presidencies were, and that's where the legacy records are retained. And of course, now they've become the public records. And we can say that from the middle of 18th century, these public records are accessible in continuous series. Most of them have it that way. So, and they are accessible.
And just to follow up to that, what would be like the year range? Till when do we find records available? And can you give us an example of how does this access to a public archive work? How does a journalist access it?
Yeah, to begin with, as I said, most of these, the major states that I mentioned about, they have the colonial records from the middle of 18th century. And of course, the remaining states, they might have inherited the records which were left behind by the residencies. I mean, the British resident who was there, or the records which were there with the princely state, which were handed over to the concerned state. That is possible. And most of them, we can say, they start somewhere around the 18th century. And as per the legislations and the guidelines being followed in India, records which are over 30 years old, only they are accessible. Okay. So the archives gets them around 25, after they are 25 years old, after following some appraisal policies and all, the records come in. Not all records get transferred to the archives, public archives. And once they are transferred after 25 years, they get another 5 years to work on it and make them accessible. So roughly 30 years old records are accessible to the users. So anything beyond that, I mean, the contemporary records will not be there.
Yeah, we'll have to look for alternate sources.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you for that. Maya, I wanted to ask you my next question about, we directly went into public archives, but there are many other kinds of archives, physical and as well as on the digital space. Can you give us a broad overview of the kinds of archives that are available for us to access? And any other insights that you have on how does one access these? Because each follows a different protocol. How does one look into them?
Yeah. Thank you, Karthik. Actually, I think what Jaya mentioned is exactly the dominant imagination about archives in India, which is they're official, they're state sort of directed, and there is a 30-year time lapse, right? This is the way we're used to sort of imagining access. But the fact of the matter is that there is a complication of the record since the digital. And by that, I mean that the state archives are definitely, very, very significant in every way. But in addition, there are also other traces that are now coming into public view through both sort of private actors, other institutions, and also researcher-generated catalogs that they would like to share with the general public. So in the old days, what people saw with research particularly was that folks went ahead, did their work, and they only saw the published version. And now there is an effort to kind of make the backlog also equally visible. And so many now platforms exist to enable that to happen, because obviously this needs to be discoverable. So since the time of the digital, what we have seen really is, at the very least, finding aids are much easier, where folks can at least sort of search through not only what exists in physical spaces, but often things like oral histories, other interviews, which are uploaded as digital files, which may not even really may not exist in a physical location, but exist online. And so we see a real sort of, mix of actors in terms of public, private, citizen, institutional, all kinds. There have been efforts to bring together like this range, because it's a very, very uneven universe, but it's a very interesting one for that reason, because you can compare records. The same event can be sort of echoed across different registers in very different ways. And so we see one such directory that has been pioneered at IIM Ahmedabad's archives, where they're trying to list really the existing repositories that are available, both analog and digital. And this is amounting to over 600 at their count. But the truth is that there are also very many sort of, you could call them almost unofficial efforts, where communities and other such folks have tried to sort of create a public view, right, of their histories and their memories. And so to that existing list, I would add a new sort of variety of them, such as the Gond Digital Archives and things which are coming from spaces of saying we are not represented, so we would like to put our voice out there in the public. And I'll be really happy to post a link in the chat in a bit. And this has a very sort of very cursory, in a sense, attempt at trying to see what these sites look like. But more importantly, I think for the audience in this particular webinar, it would be interesting to see what folks' needs are and to try to populate that column, right, with folks' inputs. So I'm going to share that in a bit, and maybe people can click at leisure and see how this looks for them. But it's a very, very exciting time because of the multiplicity of actors. So what used to be only the state has really become so many more folks, that are complicating the public voice of what we hear.
Thank you. And just a note, we'll be sharing these links that we are sharing on the chat as well later after the call. In a few days, we'll compile and share it with everybody. My next question is actually to each one of you, and it's a broad one. I wanted to ask you, what are the various ways that you think archives can be used in science journalism, and why use them? It's a broad question, but I wanted to ask each one of you that. Venkat, do you want to start?
I'll take a stab. As journalists, I suppose we are broadly definitely interested in stories or sort of stitching together, some sort of meaning from a set of events that we are encountering, right? I'm just I'm reducing the field very broadly, so do excuse me for a moment. But within these stories, there is, I mean, at least what I like to say as an archivist in my current sort of life is that every archival object comes from a whole set of stories. There is no object that exists on its own. And there's a set of events that have happened that have led rise to this object. And which means that this object can now, and our job as archivists is to sort of describe and make it accessible to you guys as researchers and journalists so that you could come ahead and find new meaning or ways in which you can connect it to the story you're looking at. So this question of why, I mean, besides the fact that the archives are an absolute treasure for so many things that are in discussion today. Just yesterday, I had a question from one of your colleagues about the El Nino, and there are so many references that we could find which are very relevant to the conversation that's going on today. So there is the cyclical aspect that the archive always offers. That's another thing to perhaps consider. I guess that is the why part of it. How I can probably also come back to, maybe I'll after hearing from Maya and Jaya.
Karthik,
Yeah.
I mentioned about the public records and like the time period roughly. As far as the National Archives of India, because that's where I was for such a long time, apart from these government records, they also have some private papers. And among these private papers, there are some related to the scientists. But the problem is I've spent around 30 years there, but I've hardly seen anyone visiting archives to use them. One reason could be because nobody knows about it, that it exists there. But, and of course, that may not be exactly detailed information, but that could also be the way to reach to other kind of sources. Like it may have private paper, the letters written by these scientists, or it may have some reference to some government communication. So you can, interconnect it with the other government records. Similarly, for science related, especially I mentioned that, public records are over 30 years old. But if you're writing a story, say the COVID pandemic or the influenza pandemic, and that is the only time I've seen one journalist visit National Archives of India, but probably he was in a hurry, so he couldn't spend much time. But he came looking for the Spanish flu records. And of course, there are detailed records on these kind of, anything that happens, there will be a government reference. The only thing is, they should have that kind of time. If one is in a hurry, they may not get it. So, and of course, going through the nuances, which finding aid or which subject was dealt with in which department at what time. These are things, one has to know, especially in case of public records, and that is a challenge. But it's not something one can't overcome. The only thing is they have to spend I always tell anyone who visits archives, they should be prepared for at least 1 week. Within 1 week, I'm sure they'll get some very useful information. And I think that's the secret.
Got it.
Yeah.
Wanted to ask a quick follow-up to this itself, before I forget that. The how of it. If time is a constraint, once a journalist walks into an archive and tries to look for these, where does the engagement with an archivist who is at that center, what kind of engagement do you see is constructive and useful for getting that information? And then, because I would imagine to use an archive, apart from just finding a reference to it, there's context to it, there is you need to find a lot of other kinds of information that go along with it, besides just referencing it. So where do you see an engagement between the journalist and the archivist happening in this entire process?
Most of these public records have an archivist manning the research room or the reading room, whatever they may call it. And they are supposed to be people who know about the record series within the custody of that public archive. And they should be able to guide these people, like generally, at least I can tell you from my own experience, if a fresh person came, and most of them wouldn't know where the records are.
Sorry, I lost you, Jaya.
I think Jaya's screen is frozen. I'll just try and step in.
Different ministries
She's
or
back.
department to get more information, to get person searching for. Yeah. Yeah. So that's how one starts, and the archivist will support. They will give as much of information as possible.
Okay.
So your questions can be detailed, spend some time with him or her and tell them exactly what you're looking, the time period. Some clues you can give, and then of course they'll help you out. That's their job.
Thank you. Thank you. Maya, going back to you with the previous question on why do you feel it's relevant for journalists to use archive in the first?
Yeah. I think one of the impediments really was the fact that you had to go to a site which was, like in the case of Delhi, not necessarily accessible to all. Then you had to physically look through a card catalog, and it required a lot of time, right? So in terms of now searching online, at least, I think the job of the journalist as detective, right, means that there are so many more places to start looking for clues. And even though, yes, it can be time consuming depending on how deep a dive you want to make, the point here, I think, is that word of interconnection, right? What Jaya was saying, that to connect a present event to a past event is so much simpler now, for the reason that you can use keywords, the metadata, etc., allows for those kinds of searches, which, especially in terms of digital, investigations, is much easier. So it could be that for many journalists, this will be a book later in their career. But I think in terms of a very rich, set of sources, now I think the record is actually available in a way that was not possible 30 years ago. So therefore, it is certainly the thing that's changed it. And this is a good point to drop in the chat, a list of sorts where people can start looking at what might exist or be useful to them. So I'll do that now. Thanks.
Okay. Thank you. Venkat, going back to where you left the how of it, I wanted to understand, how does one start this process? I have reached the door of an archive, or I have, firstly, I wouldn't even know where a particular topic would lie in which archive in the country from this whole list that you have compiled. So how does one approach this process? If you can just explain, and if you have an example to explain, even that would be great.
Yeah, let me just share my screen again. I think hopefully this will address some of the questions in the audience, but let me see if it can. Sorry. So I'll try and address a couple of points that you'd raised, Karthik. So a general hack to understand how archives are structured, and this is perhaps a useful point, because I think there was a question about environmental legislation in the National Archives. I don't know if you can see my screen in a second.
You can share it full screen. Yeah.
Yeah.
So now we can see it.
Right. So this question of finding material in the archive, most archives, generally speaking, are structured around where the material comes from. And this is perhaps just a very important thing to know if you go deep into the archive top down. So if you want to look for something, you need to understand who may have created the record, or where, who's the source. So archives are structured around source. That's just an important sort of, there's a certain language of archives that way. Generally speaking, one could just go on your search browser and put a search query, and if the catalog is crawlable, you might be able to find it. But if you're going into an archive directly, like the National Archives, you need to know which ministries, which departments. So it's a little bit of that thinking a little bit before diving into it. And of course, Ajay can tell you a little bit more about the Abhilekh Patel portal that the National Archives also has. A few keywords that I have found useful generally, this is very obvious to many people perhaps, but putting these words, especially the word finding aid, or putting the word special collections, are words that will at least change the nature of your search results if you're using a search browser. So what filters to the top if you're still using browsers to search. I don't know if people are using LLMs to make queries. So just sort of, if you're using these, but these are at least spaces these are ways in which you'll start to get catalogs. So these are just archives jargon for the catalogs that help you understand the way the material is structured. So just putting the word finding aid would change the nature of the results that you get. It'll tell you where the material is located. There was one more question, Karthik, that you had talked about, what do you do when you enter the door? And Kollegale Sharma had rightly pointed out that many archives, unfortunately, require you to have a letter from someone, someone above you in the food chain. I cannot apologize on behalf of every archive, but I feel like we should. I don't know, but it's unfortunate, but that is the reality for many archives. I don't think there's a legal rule, to my knowledge. Jay and Maya, correct me if I'm wrong, but if you're coming by the front door of an archive and they stop you saying you need a letter from someone else, if you could push back and ask them to share the policy or the document where it says this letter is required and where that came from would be a useful thing. But many archives do have online portals to check the catalogs out. Most archives should at least have an access and use sort of page or a guidelines page that tell you how to navigate the archive. And that would be a good starting point to see. There would be some rules to say that you require, allow us N number of days before you get a response from us, or make sure that you have the following government ID before you approach us in person. We are open only on Mondays and Wednesdays. I mean, these seem like obvious things, but just sort of preparing yourself mentally for some of these, especially for large public systems, public archives. I need to flag a couple of things here, which I've shared in my sheet here, that there are two things that perhaps are important to know. One is archives are very good at telling you where stuff comes from, provenance. The archives may rarely be able to verify the truth within the material they preserve. So the letter that you see from an archive, the archive may not necessarily be able to verify whether the contents of the letter are true. It's difficult for an archive to do it at scale, but what an archive can tell you is where it came from. Right. And if you know that it came from a particular ministry or whatever, then you know it is legal deposit. You know that this is part of a public record. So so there's a reason why there are, in the newspapers, you'll see how people are very particular about expunging what was said in Parliament, for instance. So there's this idea of what is public record. That's one thing. And the other is viewing material. Archives are mostly custodians of material. And this corrects your question about Karthik about how does a journalist use it for a story tomorrow? Archives are not copyright holders most of the time. They're custodians of history. And their ability to grant rights to use it may not always be there. The rights very often may belong still to the rights holder of a letter, so to speak. So it's just useful to distinguish between these two. However, the Indian laws, copyright exemptions rules have extensive exemptions for using of archival material. And again, not to offer the shameless self-promotion, but Milli does have a page where you can look at a cheat sheet of exemptions to the Copyright Act that you can download and take a look at. I feel like I lost my train of thought here. I have a list of archives that I can show you, but I'll stop here.
No, these are really important points and practical points for us to know and understand how to use them, specifically the aspect about access that you spoke about. Regarding the copyright aspect, I wanted to ask and clarify one thing. Say if I come across a reference or I would like to use something, I think the first step for me is to speak with the institution, the archivist, to understand. Maybe that would be my next step, right? To then go ahead and understand how to use it.
Right. Yeah. In Indian law, at present, archives are, in a sense, bracketed under the same frame as libraries. In the Copyright Act, the word archive, to my knowledge, I don't think it's there. I need to verify it once more. So they serve a similar function as being a public space, which can keep copies of records and can show it to anyone who comes and looks at it, but may not be able to authorize reproduction for others. I mean, just to sort of read the all down. And the archive could tell you whether or not it holds the rights to the material. If it's a collecting, if it's an archive of an institution, suppose you go to a big corporate entity and you go to their archives, and they're only keeping records that they created, their governance documents, their board meetings, if, Godrej has, obviously, as many people know, has a very extensive corporate archive. Wipro has one in Bangalore. Kirloskar has one. So, they're all the big corporations do. So the likelihood of them having the rights to the material is fairly high because they are the custodial and rights holding body of the parent entity, the corporation. The National Archives, because it's public record, and Jaya, please correct me if I'm wrong, the rights are available for public record use.
Yes.
Right. Yeah. If you're a collecting archive, if you're getting stuff from other people who have also collected from other people, like letters and so on and so forth, then it gets to be a little more murky. Teen Murthy, for instance, which holds many private papers. it's slightly more difficult to think a little bit about who holds the rights. And the archivist would typically help you on this, but it very often is not the archive.
Got it.
Very simply put, I use this example a lot. If Karthik is writing an email or letter to Shrestha, then Karthik holds the rights to that letter, although Shrestha is the owner of the letter.
Yeah.
You go to a bookshop and you buy a book by an author, you own the book, but not the words of the author.
Got it.
I just want to jump in and say we live in an era where a lot of collecting archives are receiving people's private papers. So particularly for journalists, right, like Praful Bidwai's papers are in Ashoka archives. This is a new sort of possibility in terms of looking at a topic in a more, how do you say, less official way, where you can sort of now look at the notes and the drafts and the things that didn't make it to print. And particularly if folks are revisiting a topic and they want to see a much longer record, I feel like personal papers are a really fine site to do that in terms of delving into these spaces now. Yeah.
Thank you. I think, but what I'm also understanding is that the usage and how we use this is not uniform across all platforms. It would change from case to case, and we have to be just aware of this when we get into the subject and have a conversation with that institution, the archivist, to understand how we can, if and how we can use it in our reporting. Jaya, I would like to come back to public archives and ask you, because before this we were having a conversation about science journalism specifically, and the usage of archives in science journalism. For starters, can you give us a glimpse of what kind of materials? I know, I'm sorry that it's a really broad one, shooting a very broad one, but what kind of materials do you think that are of current relevance that would be in public archives and are literally waiting to be looked into and used?
Yeah, actually, even if you're working on some current story, there must be a background to that. Or if you want to see how a particular situation was handled, say 50 or 100 years back, like I gave you the example of epidemic, the influenza pandemic and all that. You can always look back how it was handled 100 years back when they had the Spanish flu. So for that, again, there will not be one particular department records that one has to consult. There are multiple actors. Like even nowadays, if you're covering the, disasters, just as an example, it's not science related as such. But if you want to cover disasters, there are multiple ministries: agriculture, health, PMO, home affairs, now NDMA. So similarly, at that time also, there were multiple departments that were handling. You had the home department, you had the commerce department, and all of them had wonderful files. And so definitely you'll get something or the other. One just has to spend some time. That is the whole issue. And I also indicated that National Archives of India has some private papers. There are 3-4 private papers, like you have private papers of Y. Subbarao, Ramanujam. Of course, for Ramanujam, it's just one volume. But you have M.N. Saha papers. So unless and until somebody comes in, and the problem is, the people who have listed them out, they're mostly from history background. So the catalog may not actually reflect everything that is there in that particular file or the collection. So one has to, at least if you're interested in the stories in and around or anything related to these people, visit that place and also look up the ministries or departments in which they could have had some communication or anything relevant.
That's very interesting. Yeah, because one piece of information can be used and looked at through multiple perspectives and based on what my need is. So that's again an important one.
Yeah, Karthik, I'll just like to add, I saw some comments about difficulty in accessing National Archives of India.
Yeah.
Let me just tell you, most of these public records follow the Public Records Act 1993 of National Archives of India. And some states have, of course, they have their own legislation, but which is mostly based on the Public Record Act and rules of National Archives of India. And if as per this rule and the act, if somebody is sponsored by some institution, only then they have to take a letter of introduction. An Indian citizen can visit. Nobody's asking you not to visit. The only thing they'll require is a proof of identity, proof of being an Indian citizen. So I really don't know in what context they went. So just for their information.
Okay.
Oh.
I think if somebody in the participants has tried and hasn't
Yeah,
been able to, maybe during the Q&A again you can specify
yeah,
the
yes, of
case
course.
and maybe we can try and solve it.
Yeah.
Maya, there's one word that we came across multiple times in this conversation, and that was catalog. And I wanted to take this opportunity just to understand what that clearly means when in the context of archives. Can you explain that to us, please?
Yeah. So, in the old days, I mean, people remember this from libraries also. Card catalogs literally organized, the items in the library. So spatially, you knew where something was based on the location written on that catalog. And today, it's obviously different in the digital. But I want to sort of complicate the idea of a very linear understanding of keywords as we're used to sort of thinking about themes in, and also putting in other forms of search, such as spatial, the way images are searched changes in terms of what the database holds, etc. So because the database is no longer simply this is a card catalog that leads you to this location, right, in this building, there is a way in which the catalog is something that is telling you what the contents of this archive are, but the way you search that catalog has really changed. And so this is the reason as to why, for instance, when people are, let's say, working on a particular part of the country in terms of the map, they can use finding tools which are spatial to access the catalog in a way that was just not possible. So I think everyone, of course, everyone who's done research knows what traditional sort of search looked like in terms of catalogs as indexing where things are located and what you might expect to find. And given the complications you mentioned about copyright and such also, oftentimes you may not get the complete contents of what, the holding is, but you at least know it contains this. So like I may not be able to republish somebody's private letter, but I know that this is the place that I can find those letters in. And for that reason, I think Milli's effort is very much to at least populate, the catalogs in the public domain so that people can search better. Whether they get their hands on that is a whole different question. But yeah.
Okay. Venkat, at this point, do you think you can share a few of these catalogs that Maya just spoke to us about from your corrections that you think are of use specifically for journalists and science journalists?
Sure, let me give this a shot. Back to sharing my screen. Sorry, I was just trying to respond to some of the questions in the chat.
Thank you for that.
No worries. Okay, probably see my screen. Do you?
Yes, we can.
Okay.
You can maximize it.
Yeah, strangely, I can't.
Okay, it's okay. I think
that's fine. I mean, you can see my screen. Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah.
So I shared this. This is this is not a list of archives as much as it is a list of places that keep some history material for history in here. So I found it to be a good place to just at least get a sense of the sheer diversity of places that one could look at. Right. And some of them may not even be accessible. That's fine. But at least you now know that there are over 600 places for a variety of things. And this is an easily scalable project. So shout out to IMA for first doing this. So it's a good starting point, I think, as a list of places. Yeah. Many people have heard about the 1947 Partition Archive. There's a movie out there on Netflix, which is drawing on their histories. So, fun fact. The Ashok Archives, for folks who live in and around Delhi, has a lot of material from contemporary India. So their catalogs are available on their website. So you can take a look at their catalog. So most of them will have should have some, they have a link called catalogs, for instance. The Godrej Archives has a lot of, so again, I'm sort of separating one point to say that I said this right in the beginning, that the science is always there in the material. So I guess, we just have to keep looking at what is it that we want. The Godrej Archives has extraordinary material around space science because of their work with ISRO in the early days. So you'd have to see who is working with whom towards what purpose, who's building what instruments, etc. So The 1947 Partition Archive could give you histories of particular people who had a career in science, who then moved away from it, or who moved towards a career in science. So you'd have to read within the material to find the science in it. The science is always there. The Ashok Archives has a lot of material from ecologists, which you can take a look at if that's an area of interest. Godrej, I just mentioned, it's a corporate archive. IIM Ahmedabad has material from people who've been in architecture, and these architects have also built institutions of science. So you start to see these overlaps, or people who have been involved in management, especially the oral history interviews that they have there. The French Institute is one of the most unique centers in this country, and they have an amazing digital portal. I don't have the link here, but maybe some of us can drop the link in the chat. They keep records of photographic records of religious places from across the southern states. They also have a lot of ecological material. They have cartographical material. So it's and the catalog is actually fully accessible online. You don't even need to go there anymore. They really have an amazing resource to look at. And Ramesh Kumar, who's the archivist there, is one of the foremost photo archivists in the country, if not the archivist. The National Archives I'll skip because we've discussed this a moment ago. ISA Kolkata, I think, is a center that many writers and journalists have used, or at least know of, because it has the papers of PC Mahalanobis. And so if you have any interest in statistics, in post-independent economics in the country, sort of overlaps in these spaces, or on Haldane, JBS Haldane's connection with Mahalanobis is evident. So you'll find those materials, those pieces of histories in their catalog. Their catalog is not as publicly visible. They have some photographic material, but they are accessible to researchers who are willing to go there and sit and work from their office or their physical spaces there. And I know many people who have done this. I just shared this to say that archives are not, nation state aligned. I mean, there's something called the NATO archive. So if you want to understand the history of diplomacy, the history of science cooperation across countries, where does, geopolitics feature into it? You can look at something like a NATO archives, or the UN archives will tell you a little bit. In fact, if you look at the World Bank archives, you will get histories about the Narmada Bachao Andolan. So again, you have to see who and what, and you have to see when did the World Bank stop supporting it. And those catalog histories are available online. So again, all you need to do is put World Bank, Narmada Finding Aid catalog, and you'll find something. Those are the words that you'd end up putting. I'll skip this one. There's just an example to say that libraries very often will have special collections. So, it's just something to consider. Many libraries would have special collections. The Rampur library, is that the one? I can't remember the full name. Maya?
Rampur Raza?
The Rampur Raza library is just an extraordinary treasure. I don't think they have a public catalog, but if you're able to access it, that'll be great. I mentioned the UN, so UNESCO is another center. This is another center that I'm also based at the archives at NCBS, which is a science archive. So it does, the numbers at the bottom are actually incorrect. It now has about 110 collections and 4 lakh objects, but it is material from across the sciences, across registers, across the country. So do take a look. The catalog is available online. So just you can Google for that. I'll skip this one because it's not relevant to our conversation, or it might still be. You can take a look later. And this I'll skip. Oh, and this one I wanted to share as an example before we launch into is just, if you're interested in Union Carbide histories and such, you'll find there's, if you just look for Bhopal and you look for, so in the Azim Premji University, there's an amazing set of papers by P.M. Bhargav, who was a scientist based at CCMB in Hyderabad. And you'll see material in the catalog. Again, all I did was just look for catalog, PM Bhargav, AP archives, and you'll see this structure. All of this is in the public domain, at least the catalog is. So you'll see there's a file regarding the humanitarian mission to Bhopal in 1993. And so, in theory, you could make a request to go visit them. And I know a few researchers who have done this recently. So just sort of sharing a few examples like this. Yeah, this was the exemptions that you can take a look at. I think O just shared a link in the chat, so you can just download the brochure. Sorry. Okay.
Thanks a lot, Venkat. That was a 2-minute rapid fire with so many catalogs. We'll spend our entire lifetime in one.
Yeah. So don't worry, just remember the IMA and start from there.
Yeah. No, but it's a great insight to know that there is so much, and with people with different interests can go to a different place. And like I said, we'll be sharing some of these links on email. So if you haven't been able to make notes on time like me, I think we'll get that email later as well. At this point, I would like to shift gears a bit and invite one of our journalists and SJAI members to speak about a story where she used archives to tell a story. Sana Ghosh, okay, Sana is here. Sana Ghosh is part of the SJAI governing body and an associate editor at Nature India. We'll take the next 5 minutes where she presents her story as a case study to tell us how she came across the story, how she went about reporting on it, and how did she use archives in doing so. After that, we'll have a brief exchange, maybe between the speakers and Sahana, or I can ask a few questions. And after that, we'll get into a Q&A with the participants. Over to you, Sahana.
Hey Karthik, do you have my slide deck? Are you able to share?
I do, I can.
Thanks everybody, and great to see Venkat, Maya, and Jaya, of course, again. Just to let everybody know, I've done multiple trips to the NCBS archives. So it's opened up a lot of perspectives for me, and also given me a lot of, it's added a lot of value to the stories that we've done at Nature. And before that, when I was in mainstream journalism, because I am from a very interesting science history related city, Calcutta or Kolkata. So there were plenty of archives here in the city as well that I was also visiting. So introduction to archives or science archives wasn't something random. I mean, it wasn't because somebody had asked me to go to a science archive and do certain things, but it was something very organic for me. So yeah, and I've used.
Sana, is my screen visible now? Your presentation?
Yeah, it's
Okay.
visible.
I'm putting
So
it in slide.
Now
you.
it's visible.
Yeah, lovely. So I've used archival material a lot in journalism, and I continue to use them in different ways. And a lot of the archival materials are also available online, which has made life simpler. Again, thanks to NCBS also for making it easy for us to access some of these digital collections as well. This is a photo. I'm going to start off with this particular photo. This is from the archive at Max Planck Institute of History of Science, where I was doing a residency in 2023, right? So my focus was on the Indian Ocean science history. I look at global change as the larger theme in my journalism. And I wanted to look at, how did India start looking at oceanography and ocean science, and how was India looking at paleoclimate studies in the ocean science realm? Paleoclimate is a topic that I often write about. So the coring or the ecological history that comes from paleo studies, right? These studies of past climate and climate change. It comes through sediments or mud cores, which you extract from the ocean or from land. So one of the first proponents of this was somebody from Germany. So my project was also aligned to that, because I wanted to look at how some tech that was developed by German researchers eventually became, the most important tech in paleoclimate and understanding the past climate history. So that's where I was. I was embedded with the Anthropocene working group at that point in time. 3 years ago, that was the year when the Anthropocene, it was just being proposed, and whether it was formalized or not, that debate had happened, right? It's not formalized, but people use that. So it was a pretty intense year for me there. What happened was that I was also interacting with all other historians and researchers and archivists during my 3-month stay. And somebody just also happened, besides the story that I was looking at, somebody just mentioned, that, oh, next year is the 100 years of Einstein-Bose equation, right? Karthik, you can go to the next slide now. So yeah, so this was 2023, and then everybody was discussing that in 2024 we are going to celebrate the centenary year of this particular equation, or the Bose statistics. And the person I was talking to was Alex Bloom, who works on foundational physics, the history of foundational physics and the philosophy behind it. And during our conversations, and these were very random coffee chats, he just mentioned that, what Bose had suggested very simplistically in a letter to Einstein in 1924. It was not that simple at all. There was a big idea involved, and that's where Einstein sort of comes in, right? Einstein comes in and says that, look, this is a really big idea. It's not as simple as you think it is. And then I looked up the year 2024. I had come back, and then I saw that there was a conference on this 100 years, right? So it was in Bose Institute in Calcutta, in my city. So I attended the conference. I stayed in touch with the historians, with the archivists there in Germany. I got a lot of inputs from the conference itself as to why something that is 100 years old in science still matters today. And again, just a reminder, 2023 also, I believe, was the year when India declared the National Quantum Mission, right? So why was something that happened 100 years ago, how was it relevant today? So that was the question that I was asking as a journalist. And as a journalist, we are also looking at newsworthy angles. So what is news? Because you need to publish a story, you always need a news hook. So the news hook was 2024 being the 100 years, and that, why this equation or why this relationship and why the statistics set off so much that, with other researchers also pioneering other forms, it's now what we know as quantum mechanics, right? So that was the entire story, or the angle that emerged after sort of multiple rounds of conversations and after visiting that particular conference. If you can go to the next slide, Karthik. So this was what triggered the archival reporting, right? So I was not looking, I didn't go to an archive and just suddenly got an idea. I was talking to people. I had a very basic understanding of this. But what triggered was that there was a contemporary question for me to answer. And also I was following the people and the philosophy, not just papers or not just documents, because in this case, the philosophy of science was very important. As I said, the big idea involved here was too important to the story. So then attending that particular centenary celebration really unlocked a lot of new nuances, which I could connect from history, from the past to present, and also what might happen in the future. And I was also asking this question, is there something that isn't there in published literature that I could access, beyond published literature, and who are these people that I can look towards? So there's also a component of oral history if you read the story. I also happened to get in touch with S.N. Bose's former student who's still alive, Partha Ghosh, and he gave me a lot of more context, lot more about the philosophy and what exactly was happening around that time in 1924. What helped me, of course, was that in my early career days, I had also reported a lot on physics and maths. So in 2012, this discovery of Higgs boson, right? That was the big news of that year, the science news of that year. And I was in mainstream. I was an agency reporter. So I'd already reported on bosons, on Bose, and the controversy, that he should have been awarded Nobel Prize, things, so on and so forth. And then later in my career, I'd looked at quantum. I'm still looking at quantum and other things as well. So that really helped me, because I was not coming from just some, suddenly I was not coming at it from anywhere unknown. I had a bit of knowledge about, in terms of just as a news person, as to where this might lead. So that really helped my case. Next slide, Karthik. And that sort of really helped me. So this is what basically I did. I developed this guidebook also for a bunch of my peers. You start with institutions, scientists, historians who are connected to the subject. Institutional memory is very important, which is what happened with the Bose story. And I think when you go to an archive, sometimes when you want something very specific, because again, if you don't have a lot of time and you know that there's a story that you're going to tell using archival material, I think you should explain your questions very clearly to the archivists in question, right? Rather than asking, give me everything on Bose. Because the Bose Institute archive here is really amazing. It's online, of course. You can also check out all the materials. You can't sit and look at every material. So you have to know what your keywords are going to be. Again, this is, for my case, this is what worked out. And a lot of the archival material that I looked at was correspondence between Bose and Einstein, because that was adding a layer to the story, which many were familiar with, but it added more layers to the story. And I looked at the original documents because in some of the internet resources, the numbers and dates weren't matching. So the original material, the original letter was really easy to access online, and I could match and I could verify. Again, there were a bunch of other letters I looked at. Again, the history and philosophy of science came here. And what really guided me was that I had a specific reporting question, and I knew what deserved my immediate attention. Because when you start looking at archives, you're going to be spiraling, right? Because there's so many fascinating things to Bose's life or Einstein's lives. And you might just go into that rabbit hole and you might not emerge from it, and no story might emerge. But I knew what I was looking at, and I knew what deserves my attention at that point in time. The last one is, of course, there's a small checklist which I have sometimes for myself is, what is the question am I trying to answer? You also I don't want to waste people's time, archivist time, in saying that, oh, like, show me everything that's there. So I want to see if there's a question that I want to answer, and can an archivist guide me to a specific page or like to a specific folder, in terms of all the content that there is. Who holds the relevant records? We saw an amazing list of archives today, and I think that's the important question. So who holds what, basically, and who can help me navigate them? If I'm finding it difficult to really understand some of the language, especially with British colonial records, and I've done that in the past, I've gone to climate scientists who look at archives, and they've helped me navigate that language as well. And what does the archive reveal that published sources don't? This is pretty important. The bunch of podcasts, we did a whole series with NCBS, and there are fascinating papers, right? The MS Swaminathan collection of papers, and I found so much information there that's not there in published records or not there in published papers. And there was a podcast episode that we did on the Basmati, the history of breeding of Basmati. That's where all that context, all that information came in handy, because not everything was in a published paper. So I've shared all the links here, relevant links here for all these stories. And again, I also want to see if I can independently verify what I find. As Venkat said, that just because you see something in an archival record that, they are not saying that this is the true information, but maybe if there's another way to also verify what I'm finding. So it usually there are different ways also. And also asking yourself, why does this historical material matter now? So for us as journalists, I think, why does this matter now? And why do we need access to archival material is important. So that's how, at least I've been looking at archives in terms of my journalism. Recently, we did a story on a prehistoric hyena den, which was at that point in time, which is now in northwestern Pakistan. And I had to go through a lot of archival records to look at the geologists or the archaeologists, paleontologists' diaries and their notes to piece together the timeline, verify the timelines. So it helps you in different ways. You might not quote an archive all the time, because sometimes it just provides you that verification, which as editors, we need to do that. And as journalists, we need to be cognizant of. So sometimes you're not saying explicitly in a story that I've looked at an archive here, but you've looked at an archive to also verify your, what other sources are also saying. And this is something that I do regularly, and it can be done even for quick turnaround stories. Yeah. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Sana. That was, I think, 5 to 7 minutes of a really condensed piece of all the work that went into doing that one story. Instead of me asking questions, I would like to just see if there are 1 or 2 questions from Maya, Venkat, or Jaya for Sana, which would help us deconstruct that storytelling process. And after that, we'll take questions from the audience for around 10 minutes.
I have a question for Sahana, actually, which was that from the editorial standpoint, how receptive are news desks for deep historical dives? Is it usually an anniversary or something which makes that, salient or what? Yeah.
So especially with the COVID-19 pandemic, we did see a lot of deep dives into infectious disease history. So I think it takes some event or some international day or something for things to be newsworthy. But having said that, I've worked with great editors, or even now as an editor myself, I think we don't say no to reportage that does deep dives. It's that we really are aware that our audience would want to read something which they also find relatable. So I think the so what and why now question is important. So even if you don't have to align your story to a day or to a year, like I aligned myself, but I knew that that would bring in a different kind of readership, because then, after that, Bose Institute sort of stuck up that entire piece and everything up in one of their own smaller conferences. So then it gained a new audience, and that was the audience that I was targeting, right? So the history and the philosophy of science of it, and science doesn't exist in just in a silo by itself. There's a history and philosophy, and sometimes there are really dark patches of history as well. So I feel like a lot of news desks are being receptive to deep dives. I know for a fact that I'm personally looking at El Nino now. The history of El Nino, I've done a bunch of stuff earlier, but I'm not now looking at it in a much more rigorous way, in a much more structured way. I'm looking at a lot of stories around restoration, but with a sort of ecological history kind of an approach. So these can be done. These are part of my news cycle, right? So it's not that I have to align it with some important day or something like that, but it helps to gain audiences for these kind of stories. And I think you need to be very careful in how you interpret what's there in an archive. I don't interpret what's in an archive without first discussing it with an archivist or a science historian, because the kind of topics that I deal with can become very controversial. So that is a caution that I would say applies, that you go and you dig out an information, that's great. But before you put it in your story, I think just do those usual checks and balances, chat with an historian, chat with an archivist, and see how an observation or a fact in an archive, how is that interpreted by somebody else, right? So I think that's important, super important. Yeah.
Thanks, Anna. Yeah, Jaya, please.
Shahana, you mentioned that you have consulted some of these colonial records also. I'm sure that the terminologies that you're using nowadays, you may not have got them if you were searching for the colonial period records. So I think that is one tip that you should be giving to your other journalists also, because you have to look back at that time period. And like climate change per se, you may never get. But there were studies being done on glaciers or the river belt, depleting delta, the rainfall, all those things, multiple things have actually worked towards that. So I think if you can give these kind of tips, if you're doing anything like that for your science journalists, that would be really wonderful.
Sure. I mean, I've looked a bunch of times in the Mosam journals, right? IMD's fantastic records and a rich repository for people who work on climate. In fact, and I was looking at cyclones, right? Because there were a series of stories we'd done, and I just wanted to go back and see what was being said about cyclones and how the word cyclone was coined, right? That in itself is a great story to tell. And it keeps coming back. These stories keep coming back. So the cyclone word itself was easy, but I was not typing climate change back in these records. I was being very specific. So you take a broader, it's like you have a piece of cake and you divide it into slices, and you just use that small slice and you then use those keywords. So yeah, I mean, and I had a lot of help also, because a lot of former IMD scientists, for example, asked, they told me, they advised me that look at these keywords. For the ocean science history, that's also in the link, I had a lot of oral history to get to. I came back from Germany and then I was doing a lot of chasing with former directors of these oceanography institutes, because nowhere did I find what exactly happened. And Then when I spoke to the former directors, what I recognized was that India was part of a lot of international efforts, the IODP, Indian Ocean Discovery Project, for example, and that's how the entire setup, the talk of setting up an Indian Oceanography Institute sort of came into being. So it also shows you that how much international relations are important. So if you're looking at reporting on science diplomacy or science policy, and I do that sometimes, so again, chasing former directors of institutes, this is the oral history. They provided me with a lot of materials which were not there on any websites. So I had to scan, I had to go through them. And thanks for AI, because it just eases up your time also. Of course, you verify, cross-verify. Similarly, for a bunch of other stories, a lot of the stories I've done on the polar sciences. And whenever there are talks of, there was a discussion that India hosted, I think last year, major treaty talk or a major policy talk on polar science. And I got the directors of some of these institutes to give me access to the past records of these meetings. And fantastically, I was led to NCPOR's website and other websites. These are, again, International Polar Sciences Associations and whatnot websites, where they had records for every meeting. So how the conversations evolved from just doing science now to protecting the ecosystem, the polar regions, and also how to sort of look at tourism pressure now. You can, if you go through all these records of past meetings, you can trace and track, and that became like just one small para in my story. So, but it's a para that kind of sets the context and the background in the story, right? Without which my story would have been incomplete. But to just do that, I had to go back in time and sort through all of this. So, and it was a quick turnaround story again. So it's not that you can't do these things, you can. You just have to be a bit strategic in knowing what exactly you want from these archives. And I'm using archives in the broader sense, not just something physical, but people who've lived that history, like Partha Ghosh, who is Bose's former student, people who've have or like institutions and institutional memories. So they're very easy to find out, and even in India, they're very easy to. At least I found them very easy to access. Right, the Kodaikanal Solar Observatory, fabulous photographs. The last point is you can use if you are into visuals and data viz. Archives offer a lot of interesting visuals for your stories. So yeah, that's always worked. The Haina story has a very important archival photograph. It's not available anywhere online. It's the University of Arizona that houses those photographs from Jeffrey Saunders' collection, right? So it's a dig that happened almost 30-40 years ago. So those are the only photos of that dig. So you have to.
Thanks, Anna. Actually, that's a very nice point that speaks about, brings back to the initial discussion that all of these materials exist, but then also about the aspect of permission and the usage that again is best known by the archivist. So I think thanks for giving us this broad overview of your various stories and how you worked on that. I would like to give say at least 5 more minutes for some audience questions. Thanks for Maya, Venkat, and Jaya to answer all these questions that are coming in on the Q&A box and for sharing all these links. But if people have any more questions, please do send it to us. Send it to us on chat, and we'll be happy to take them.
Or if someone wants to ask directly as well, they can probably raise their hand and we can unmute
Sure.
them also.
The raise the hand feature is under the react button. Dinsa has a question for Sahana. Sahana, can you see that? Else I can read it. She's asking how easy or difficult was it for you to access it? And can you talk about the process?
Honestly, for me, it was very easy. I mean, like I said, NCBS has a very easy system in place. You have to there's a particular form that you have to fill, and you have to state your intent. And also in this case, NCBS was a collaborator, but even if they were not, this was the process they had, and they just responded within a couple of days. So and I had access, so it was very easy with NCBS. With some of the other archives that are online, internet archives and other places, it's really easy as the keyword that you place. Again, I probably have not looked at some other public archives. I will, and I'll get to that. I can tell you how easy or difficult they were. But so far, Bose Institute's archives, I know that there are a couple of people, they are now looking at J.C. Bose's archival paper. So that should also be up, right? There are two Boses. So S.N. Bose and J.C. Bose. So hopefully, they'll have easy access, because when I'd asked them to see these records, they were just getting their systems up. So I believe that it will be easier now for us to access them as well. There are a lot of, in terms of physics and astrophysics, the American Institute of Physics also has fantastic collection. So, and these are all readily available at your fingertips. What was difficult, as what I explained, is the Indian Ocean Science history, how these organizations were set up. That was really not there, which was easily visible. So you had to go back, you had to call people up, and they gave you the materials to read. So yeah, it depends on story to story and what's available and what's not available. But so far it's been, I would say, 90% of this has been easy. Yeah.
Thank you. There's another question from Siddhant who asks, what kind of archives would you begin to look for psychiatry, neurology related topics? Maya, Venkat, Jaya, if you have any ideas. Oh, I think Venkat already replied. Great. I hope that answers your question, Siddhant. Mohammed Khan is asking another question on relations archives. I'm not sure what that means, Mohammed, if anybody knows. International relations. Okay.
So can I answer that?
Yes, please.
Yeah, for international relations, of course, government records he has to consult, and National Archives of India is the place where you can get a lot of information.
I'll also add, it also depends international relations in what.
What?
Yeah, so for me, it was international relations in geophysics or earth sciences. So for me, the records were very specific, and the people I went to seek those records were also very specific. Like the polar sciences, right? For that, there's a whole union. There's a bunch of the treaty organizations have their own websites, and you can access all their meeting records there. So those I would also count as international relations, but for the polar sciences.
Thank you. Do we have any more questions? Otherwise, I think we are 13 minutes beyond time. All right, so I think we shall end it here. Like I said, initially, we will share all information on email. Please do see that. There'll be a feedback form. But before that, thanks to Maya, Venkat, Jaya, the team Milli for doing this collaboration, speaking to us on this topic, which is fairly new to many of us, but is very exciting and holds a lot of potential for journalism, specifically science journalism. And thanks, Anna, for taking us through your work and sharing the behind the scenes to these stories that you have done. We will include those in the email that we send to everybody, all the participants, so they can have a better look and read that story. Thank you so much. Over to you, Shrestha.
So, thank you, everyone, especially speakers, Karthik and Shahana, and all the attendees for joining today. So before we close the webinar, we just kindly request you to check the chat box for the feedback form link, and please do share your valuable feedback with us. because we hope to utilize them for the upcoming sessions. And we really hope that this session on archives has provided practical ideas and resources that you can take back to your reporting, research, and communication work. And now, as promised, for the next webinar announcement, SJAI members can sign up for an exclusive hands-on training data by data leads on August 18th. As AI-generated content and deepfakes become increasingly sophisticated, this training on AI provenance technologies, synth ID, and backstory can help journalists verify all forms of information. I shared the link on the chat. And once again, on behalf of the Science Journalists Association of India, thank you for spending this hour with us. We look forward to seeing you at our future SJAI events and webinars.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.